Imagine standing at the marble gates of the most powerful empire in history, draped in silk and gold, crowned with jewels that catch the flickering light of 1,000 torches. You are royalty from a distant land, and tonight you will become the bride of Caesar himself. The crowds cheer as you pass, servants scatter rose petals at your feet, and musicians play triumphant melodies that echo off ancient stone walls. This should be the greatest moment of your life, the pinnacle of political alliance and personal triumph. But beneath that carefully painted smile, your heart pounds with a terror so profound it threatens to steal your breath entirely. Because you know what awaits you behind those palace doors isn't just marriage, it's a carefully orchestrated ritual of power, control, and humiliation that has broken queens before you. Tonight, you will discover why foreign royalty whispered warnings to their daughters about Roman wedding chambers, and why some chose death over the marriage bed of an emperor. If you've ever wondered about the hidden truths behind Rome's glittering facade, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that reveal the darker side of ancient history. I love hearing from viewers around the world, so drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It's incredible how we can explore these forgotten tales together across continents and centuries. What I'm about to reveal isn't just another story of ancient excess or political maneuvering. This is about how the most intimate moments of marriage became weapons of psychological warfare, how love was transformed into conquest, and how the bedroom became another battlefield where empires were won and lost. The stories you'll hear tonight will challenge everything you think you know about Roman civilization and the price of power in the ancient world. Let's begin with understanding the true nature of these royal marriages. When we think of ancient weddings, we might imagine romantic ceremonies filled with genuine affection and mutual respect. But in the halls of Roman power, marriage was never about love. It was about dominance, both political and personal. These weren't unions between equals. They were carefully calculated acquisitions, where foreign queens became living trophies, symbols of Rome's expanding reach across the known world. The selection process itself was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Roman envoys would spend months in foreign courts, studying potential brides not just for their beauty or bloodline, but for their spirit, specifically how that spirit could be most effectively broken. They looked for women who showed independence, intelligence, and strength, because the conquest of such a bride sent a more powerful message than marrying someone already submissive. These envoys would return to Rome with detailed reports that read more like military intelligence than marriage proposals. They documented everything from the princess's daily routines to her closest relationships, her fears and desires, her political opinions and personal weaknesses. All of this information was carefully filed away, creating a comprehensive blueprint for psychological control that would be implemented from the moment she set foot on Roman soil. The journey to Rome was designed to be disorienting and intimidating. Foreign queens weren't simply transported, they were gradually stripped of everything familiar and comforting. Their own servants were replaced with Roman attendants who spoke their language but reported every conversation back to imperial officials. Their familiar foods were substituted with Roman delicacies that often made them physically ill. Even their clothing was slowly replaced, piece by piece, with Roman styles that felt foreign against their skin. By the time these women reached the capital, they had already experienced weeks or months of subtle but persistent cultural assault. They arrived exhausted, homesick, and increasingly dependent on their Roman handlers for basic comfort and communication. This wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate strategy to break down their confidence and independence before the real psychological campaign began. The wedding preparations were particularly insidious because they masqueraded as honor while serving as instruments of control. Foreign queens were assigned teams of Roman women who claimed to be helping them prepare for their new life, but these advisors were actually conducting intensive psychological conditioning. Under the guise of teaching Roman customs and etiquette, they systematically undermined the bride's sense of identity and self-worth. These preparation sessions could last for weeks, with the foreign queen subjected to hours of instruction about how to walk, talk, eat, and even breathe in ways that would please her Roman husband. She was taught that her natural mannerisms were crude and barbaric, that her opinions were worthless without Roman approval, and that her value as a person was entirely dependent on her ability to satisfy imperial desires. The wedding ceremony itself was a public spectacle designed to humiliate as much as celebrate. While Roman citizens saw pageantry and grandeur, the foreign bride experienced something far more sinister. Every ritual was carefully chosen to emphasize her subordination and Rome's dominance. She was required to perform acts of submission that would have been unthinkable in her homeland, all while maintaining a facade of joy and gratitude. The vows she spoke weren't declarations of mutual love and respect. They were essentially contracts of surrender. She pledged not just her loyalty, but her complete identity to Rome and its emperor. She promised to abandon the gods of her ancestors, the customs of her people, and even the language of her birth if required. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were legally binding commitments that would be ruthlessly enforced. But the most psychologically devastating aspect wasn't the public ceremony. It was what happened afterward, when the crowds dispersed and the foreign queen found herself alone with her new husband. The wedding night wasn't a romantic consummation between newlyweds. It was the final stage of a conquest that had been months in the making. Everything that had come before, the journey, the preparation, the ceremony, had been designed to bring her to this moment in a state of maximum vulnerability and psychological dependence. Roman emperors understood that true power wasn't just about controlling armies or territories, it was about controlling minds and spirits. The wedding chamber became a laboratory where they could experiment with the most intimate forms of domination, testing how completely they could remake another human being in service to their will. These weren't acts of passion or even lust. They were calculated demonstrations of absolute power over another person's body, mind, and soul. The foreign queens who survived these ordeals often emerged as completely different people. The proud princesses who had once commanded respect in their homelands became shadows of their former selves, existing only to serve imperial pleasure and political necessity. They had been systematically stripped of everything that made them who they were, replaced with a carefully constructed persona designed to reflect Roman values and desires. Some tried to resist, clinging to memories of home and dreams of eventual escape. But the Roman system was designed to crush such hopes methodically. Every act of defiance was met with calculated punishment, not just of the queen herself, but of her family and former subjects back home. The message was clear: resistance would bring suffering not just to her, but to everyone she had ever cared about. Others attempted to find some measure of power within their captivity, using their position to influence policy or protect their homeland from Roman aggression. But even these small victories came at enormous personal cost, requiring them to become willing participants in their own psychological destruction. They learned to smile while dying inside, to express gratitude for their chains, and to find meaning in a life that had been reduced to performance and pretense. The most tragic cases were those queens who eventually began to believe the Roman narrative about their own worthlessness. Years of systematic psychological abuse convinced them that they had indeed been crude barbarians, who were fortunate to have been civilized by Roman culture. They became enthusiastic advocates for their own subjugation, praising the system that had destroyed them and encouraging other foreign women to embrace similar fates. What makes these stories even more heartbreaking is how they were celebrated in Roman literature and art as examples of successful cultural integration and imperial benevolence. Roman poets wrote glowing accounts of barbarian queens who had been blessed with Roman civilization, transformed from savage nobility into refined imperial wives. Artists created beautiful frescoes and sculptures depicting these women as grateful converts to Roman superiority, their faces serene with contentment and their postures radiating submission. But if you looked closely at these artistic representations, you might notice something disturbing in the eyes. A hollow quality that spoke of something fundamental that had been lost. The artists, perhaps unconsciously, captured the truth that the official narratives tried to hide. These weren't celebrations of transformation. They were monuments to successful psychological destruction. The ripple effects of these practices extended far beyond individual tragedy. Foreign kingdoms learned to fear Roman marriage proposals more than Roman armies because armies could be defeated, but psychological warfare left no survivors in any meaningful sense. Entire cultures began hiding their most promising daughters, sending them to remote temples or arranging hasty marriages to local nobles rather than risk having them noticed by Roman envoys. Some kingdoms tried to negotiate alternative arrangements, offering gold, territory, or military alliance instead of royal brides. but Rome understood the unique value of psychological conquest over foreign royalty. No amount of treasure could match the propaganda value of a broken foreign queen praising Roman superiority at imperial banquets, her own voice becoming testimony to Rome's cultural dominance. The imperial court developed increasingly sophisticated methods for maximizing the psychological impact of these conquests. Foreign queens weren't just isolated from their homelands, they were forced to participate in the subjugation of other foreign women. Established imperial wives were required to mentor newly arrived brides, teaching them the same lessons of submission and self-destruction they had learned years earlier. This created a horrific cycle where victims became perpetrators, each generation of broken queens helping to break the next. The psychological torture became self-perpetuating, with each woman who survived the process becoming an instrument for inflicting similar trauma on others. They weren't just enduring their own destruction, they were actively participating in the destruction of women who reminded them of who they used to be. The most chilling aspect was how expertly these women learned to hide their pain behind masks of contentment and gratitude. They became master performers, able to convincingly portray happiness and fulfillment while their inner selves screamed in anguish. Roman society celebrated their apparent contentment as proof of imperial benevolence, never recognizing or perhaps caring about the psychological devastation hidden beneath carefully maintained facades. Late at night, when the palace halls were empty and the servants had retired, these women would sometimes gather in private chambers where they could drop their masks momentarily. In whispered conversations conducted in languages they were forbidden to speak publicly, they would share fragments of memories from their former lives, half-remembered lullabies from childhood, stories their mothers had told them, dreams of landscapes they would never see again. But even these brief moments of authentic connection were dangerous. The Roman system had informants everywhere, including among the foreign queens themselves. Women who had been completely broken would sometimes report these gatherings, either from genuine belief that they were helping their sisters embrace Roman culture, or from desperate hope that demonstrating loyalty might earn them some small measure of favor or protection. The palace walls contained secrets that would have horrified even hardened Roman citizens if they had known the full truth. Behind closed doors, foreign queens were subjected to rituals of humiliation that went far beyond anything that occurred during public ceremonies. They were forced to renounce their ancestral gods in elaborate private ceremonies, sometimes involving the physical destruction of sacred objects they had carried from home. These weren't quick, symbolic gestures, but prolonged psychological ordeals designed to sever every remaining connection to their former identities. Queens would be required to personally burn letters from their families, destroy jewelry that held sentimental value, and even participate in mock funeral rites for their former selves. The ceremonies continued until the women showed convincing signs of genuine grief for the loss of their previous lives, grief that was then reframed as joy for their new Roman existence. The most insidious element was how the system convinced these women that they were willing participants in their own transformation. Through careful manipulation and psychological conditioning, many foreign queens eventually came to believe that they had chosen their fate, that their suffering was the natural consequence of their own inferior origins, rather than the result of systematic abuse. Roman philosophers and historians wrote extensively about these successful transformations, presenting them as evidence of Rome's civilizing influence on the barbaric world. They described in glowing terms how foreign queens had voluntarily abandoned their savage customs in favor of Roman enlightenment, how they had discovered true happiness through submission to imperial authority. These stories of foreign queens weren't just isolated tragedies, they were systematic campaigns of psychological warfare disguised as marriage ceremonies. Behind Rome's marble facades and golden ceremonies lay a machinery of human destruction that turned love into conquest and wedding nights into final surrenders. The next time you see those gleaming statues of imperial wives, remember the broken spirits they represent and the price of power in the ancient world. What other dark secrets lie hidden beneath history's most celebrated empires?